for Wednesday, the 3rd of Shvat. The Tanya for today is on Chayenu is on page 86. And let's get to it. We're in the middle of describing the nature of the Ahava Misoteres, the hidden love inside every Jew towards God. And we're trying to understand the nature of it. So we said yesterday it's like a flame that wants to go up to the source, even at the expense of losing its existence tethered to the wick. It'll cease to exist, but it doesn't care. And if you want to know the technical term, this is called, in Kabbalah speak, the Chachma Shebenefesh. The Chachma of your soul is the receptor to the infinity of God, and it wants very much to connect to God. And now it continues. Now, this is a general principle in the whole realm of holiness. Holiness, Kedusha, is only that which derives from Chachma, which is synonymous with holiness. Chachma in Kabbalah is called the supernal holiness. Because why? Because the Chachma, the receptor inside the person for the great infinite unknown of God, its very existence is nullified in the light of the blessed Ein Sof, which is clothed in it, and is not a thing apart. As explained earlier, we said this earlier in chapter 6. And therefore, this faculty is called Chachma. The letters could also be scrambled to be Koyach Ma, the power of nothingness, the power of humility. This is interesting. Why, Moshe, who's the highest prophet ever, was the one who was, the verse said, was the most humble upon the earth. There's no one as humble as Moshe.
Wow.
It's synonymous. Because he was so humble, he was so not self concerned, that made his receptor, his chachma, able to perceive the highest levels of awareness of Hashem.
His antenna.
His antenna. This stands in direct contrast to the klipa and sitra achra, right? The forces of impurity, of concealment, from which are derived the souls of the Gentiles, or who act only for themselves, saying, give, give. And as Esav said, feed me, in order to be independent beings and entities, separated from God, as mentioned earlier. In direct contrast to Chachma, whose nature is humility and self-nullification. So, Esav, we know, is the symbol of the animal soul, which derives from Klipa. And it's no mistake that everything that happens in the biblical characters is really indicative of about human nature in general. The Esav, the animal soul that comes from Klipa, what's one of the anecdotes in his early life? He said, feed me. We also know in Kabbalah, it talks about that Klipa is compared to a leech that says, give, give. It explains in the Steinsaltz Tanya about this point. That, just 1 second. Remember, anything that exists has to derive from God's existence. But there's two ways. There's being humble in the face of God's existence, or there's retaining selfish independence. You still need God to live. So the klipa has to leech on the kedusha because it wants to have its cake and eat it too. It wants to exist. It wants to lie. It needs life from God. So it can't acknowledge it's nothing other than a emanation of God. So it wants to exist. So it has to kind of suck from the forces of kedusha that do acknowledge that energy is coming from God.
Right.
Why it just seems unnecessary to denigrate the guardian like that.
Right.
Very trouble. It's not
Yeah.
usually it's not the peace.
Well, this really goes back to chapter 1 where it mentions it as well. It's a very fair question, and I think the way we would describe it is that it's not denigrating. If you take it at face value, it's denigrating. What it really means is we're really talking about the superpower of a Jew. The superpower of the Jewish godly soul is otherworldly. It's a supernatural phenomena, right? As we say that instinctively Jews would give their life rather than deny God's oneness at an instinctive level. That's not a normal thing. That's not the way nature works. So when we say that that everything else comes from klipa, it's really you can what do you call it? Sanitize that by saying klipa is just another word for nature. Everything else is part of nature. Nature happens to be feeling separate. It presents itself independent of the light beams that come from God, the energy beams that come from God. Understand? So if you understand it in a much like if you look at it in general Kabbalah, if you read the words literally, it's very like there's like weird, it's very like it doesn't read like into a modern mind. So that's the typical we deal with it. This really a question for chapter 1 is saying that I think there's another point, and I don't know exactly if this is like why does he mention it here? He had to mention it somewhere because when you're trying to explain the way inner dimension of things work, you're going to talk about all types of stuff: animals, people, Jews, non-Jews. Like when you talk about metaphysical mapping, you gotta be thorough. But I think maybe the point here is like this: is that this idea that klipa is ultimately, and I say ultimately, underlined ultimately, self-serving, can be extremely subtle. He quotes in the Steinsaltz Talmud, a Mishnah, we say in Pirkei Avos, it says, what's the difference between the students of Avram and the students of Bilam? And basically it contrasts Avram's, is giving, humble, and whatever. And Bilam's the opposite. He's greedy, selfish, and whatever. Okay? Why did it say the difference of Avram and Bilam? Why the students of Avram and Bilam? Because if you know anything about Bilam was considered a great prophet. Meaning, in many ways, at the root, this is could be a very sublime thing, this idea of being self-oriented. You could be a prophet. You could be Bilam, who's ultimately self-oriented, but he's a prophet. I mean, he has the trappings of a holy man to some degree. And therefore, I think his point is that it doesn't have to come out being klipa-centric, self-centric, doesn't mean you're like a pirate. It doesn't mean you're like a uncouth, taker. It could be very, very subtle. It could be someone who dedicates their life to charitable stuff.
So what's
And
wrong with that?
y-
Nothing.
there's, I didn't say anything's wrong, but you cannot necessarily say every generous act is coming from total selflessness. And it doesn't mean it's wrong. We do things like we're kind in many ways because it feels good. It feels right. But we're talking about this extremely subtle portal of meeting God where there can be no self at all, not even a little bit. That's what we're saying is unique to the godly soul. It's a portal to zero, not even subtle self direction. He quotes a story in the Steinsaltz Talmud, two stories about this. Let's say one story. Um, I don't know who he's referring to because I don't know the history. By way of illustration, a leading Irish politician of the 19th century was perhaps closer than anyone else to gaining Ireland its independence. This is on page 479. I'm going ahead. He was forced to abandon the political arena at the peak of his career because he committed adultery. Now, this man was truly dedicated to the cause of the independence of Ireland. I don't know who it was, but he fought his entire life on behalf of this cause, and he was willing to give his life for it. Yet, he succumbed to this, the adultery, knowing that it would destroy his career and his political power, and ultimately his cause, the independence of his motherland. Why? So it says later, because a spirit of folly entered him. In other words, we'll get there in a minute, but this is an example of where I don't know. Maybe I skipped ahead. Whatever.
I'm not following you, Rabbi.
In other words, the godly soul is very aware of total humility and self-effacement in the face of God. And you could be fighting for the cause of the century, and yet it can be coming from somewhat, it's so subliminal, it's so subtle, you don't even realize that ultimately that you're doing it of self-interest, even if it's good self-interest. Anyway, let's move on. 87. Therefore, those of the realm of Klippa are described as dead. The wicked are compared to as dead. The embodiers of Klippa. For wisdom, it says in the verse, wisdom gives life. And it's written, they die without wisdom. This is from Eov, meaning death is an automatic result of lack of chachma, right? Meaning, I want to also point out, and I think this is not, thank you, this is not trying to spin this, but I think there is a difference of the non-Jews of today and the heathen nations of yesteryear. Understand? And I think the Rebbe actually acknowledged this, that this is a country of kindness. Meaning, and that's why the Rebbe, yeah, many times. But the one is that, and the Rebbe pushed that this generation we should be helping connect the dots of the, let's say, the everyman Gentile to live their life out of the 7 Noahide laws. Meaning to give the basis of the kind of the kinder, more educated average person today, but you have to connect that to that they're doing this out of the 7 Noahide laws because God commanded. We have to connect. Our job is to connect the dots.
There's a lot more to it than just calling them 7 Noahide laws. They observe the Ten Commandments, and they have a lot of as much or more respect than we do for our own Torah. So I wouldn't
Okay,
demean
fine.
their efforts
But we're
or
not
their
getting to the,
thinking.
yes, there's subsets of the seven. Seven Noahide have a ton of subsets, and it's not a contradiction. So this is just a term, it's just the framework for the Torah for the non-Jewish world. Just a term.
They've got a lot.
Anyways,
Noahide laws is a framework. It's a lot more than that. You're demeaning them.
I don't think so.
The rabbi
I
says you're right, and he agrees.
I think you're getting hung up on, it's like saying the Constitution. The Constitution has a lot in there more than just, the 40, whatever, the 20 something amendments. You know, there's like millions of laws from there. So there's millions of laws out of the seven Noahide laws. It's just the term for Torah for non-Jewish world. And it might have in there some of the Ten Commandments and and it does have much more than just the seven. So it's the seven archetypes. As a matter of fact, to be fair to your point, that the way some of I have a few books on this, they try and the Noahide code to show there's a lot more in there, more than just seven laws. So the seven Noahide codes, if you want to have that, more encompassing umbrella term.
And the rabbi was agreeing with you.
But anyways, again, that's just the, and he points out, and so too the wicked and sinners of Israel, before they're put to the test of sanctifying God's name, they're living an embodiment of life of klipa, right? Where they're essentially, this is the term he says, they're dead. What is it dead? Because you're getting it from energy that has no real life of itself other than, siphoning energy off. It's like you're investing in a Ponzi scheme. You know what I'm saying? It's like you think you're getting a lot of money from the Ponzi scheme, but the Ponzi scheme is only mooching off of someone else's hard work and money. For the faculty of Chachma in the divine soul, with the spark of godliness from the light of the blessed Ein Sof, infinite, that's enclosed in it, in the sinner, the Jewish sinner, is in a state of exile in their body within the animal soul of the realm of Klipa in the left part of the heart, which reigns over them and dominates their body. Beside Golus HaShechina, in the secret, the doctrine of the exile of the Shechina, as we mentioned earlier, in chapter 17. For this reason, this love, we said this love, the hidden love that's in the divine soul, well, let's say not the hidden, the love that the divine soul has and wants to connect at all costs to the God, to its higher source, whose wish and desire is to unite with God, the fountainhead of all life, is called hidden love. Because even seemingly it's a contradictory term. Usually love is, right, is palpable. Hidden love is kind of like the opposite trapping of what love usually feels like. Love, you feel love, right? It's a feeling. And now we're saying it's a hidden, but then it's not a feeling, it's hidden. It's not a contradiction, because next page, in the Chayenu 88, it is hidden and veiled in the case of the transgressors of Israel in the sackcloth of the klipa. Because what happens? From the klipa, there enters into them a spirit of folly, which leads them to sin. As the sages remark, a person does not sin unless the spirit of folly enters unto him. In other words, the klipa, the Yetzer Hara, tricks the person to essentially ignore their true desire, the love of the godly soul, to live a life connecting to God, to the fountainhead of life. And that was where that's where he brought the story about the leading politician, that how could somebody whose whole life was willing to give their life for a cause can get involved in a sin that undermined his whole cause? Spirit of folly. The Yetzer Hara tricks you. It's a better term. It's called the spirit of insanity. of like leading you against your senses. And that's what happens. And that's why we're saying that every Jew, even the biggest sinner, has this hidden love. But the reality is, it can be very, very buried under layers of foolishness, of impurity. So the takeaway of today that I think we walked away from today that we to add to the nature of the godly soul's love, it comes from a place that is nullified, that wants to be nullified in the face of the truth of God's infinity. We call that chachma. Everybody has it. However, it's easily hidden under layers of foolishness, self-deception, and klipa. And therefore, when we talk about leading a life of mitzvahs, the Tanya makes the bold assertion that every Jew wants to lead a life of mitzvahs, because mitzvahs are essentially bonders to the infinite God. And that's what you want. You want to have that flow of life. That's life. God is eternal life. God is real life. Everything else is a Ponzi scheme. It's siphoning off. But it's very Ponzi schemes are very alluring. They're very, the Klipa schemes are very alluring. So you have to be smart.